Welcome to this week's Boss to Boss podcast. In our interviews, we feature remarkable sales and marketing minds doing imaginative things in often unimaginative markets, usually from the world of B2B. Kerry Harrison is the founder of the award-winning Tiny Giant, an agency launched in 2018 to help forward-thinking businesses harness the creative power of AI and other emerging technologies. Kerry is joining us today to share her thoughts on what I think are some of the most interesting aspects of marketing and business today. At least I'm assuming they're her thoughts, and not those of a machine she's pre-programmed this morning. On the agenda, we have as follows: the reason why confusion still seemingly reigns on matters concerning AI and machine learning in business, how Kerry and her colleagues are breaking down those perceptual barriers, one mojito at a time, and why every digital transformation project should begin with a creative session that demonstrates what AI is really all about, and why humans and machines both need one another if they're ever to achieve their potential. Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. So just to kick off then, many people have no real grasp, in my opinion, of what AI and machine learning really even mean. On the other hand, you have lots of people who are seemingly terrified of it, fearing that it is going to steal their jobs and remove any sense of meaning from their lives. Why do you feel there's so much confusion surrounding these topics?
I think one of the key reasons that people get confused or afraid is probably because of the way that we've been presented with AI through our lives. You know, a lot of that comes from movies and books and things like The Terminator, which always feel really quite scary. I think also, and one of my bugbears, I guess, is the idea of the media. The media do like a bit of scaremongering. I think there's often those headlines about AI coming to take our jobs or AI being better at human at certain roles. It's last year, I think it was, or maybe slightly before that, where GPT-3, the OpenAI text generation platform, which is a huge AI platform, came out, and The Guardian wrote an article, and the headline on it was, "A robot wrote this entire article. Are you scared yet, human?" And I thought, it's interesting because we see those kind of headlines a lot where, because it grabs our attention and it gets us reading and it gets us a bit scared, and then we're more likely to share it or get involved in that kind of article. So I think that doesn't help either. And, I suppose also we're not necessarily educated on AI. I mean, I've obviously gone through the school system. No one's ever taught me about AI or machine learning, and obviously it's a new and developing thing, but hopefully it's on the school curriculum at some point now. But we're not really ever taught about it. So everything that I've learned in the last 3 years around AI since I've been involved in this space has very much been because I've wanted to go out and learn about it. So I've read books and articles, and I've been to events, and I've spoken to people, and I've got involved in the whole process and worked with developers, and that's the only way that really I've learned to know about AI and what it all means and what machine learning is. And I suppose, unless you actually take that initiative, then really we can't get clear answers. And I think, that's one of the things that I'm quite passionate about, is getting out and sort of educating and teaching people about AI and machine learning, because I think it's quite important that we eradicate some of that confusion, because as long as people are confused or afraid, we don't necessarily engage in the necessary conversations around AI and machine learning and what it can do to our society. So for me, that's quite an important thing. So I do lots of talks and I go and deliver workshops wherever I can, because AI machine learning feels like it's very much owned by those big tech giants like Facebook and Google. And, the average Joe doesn't necessarily know a lot about it. And if we don't know a lot, we can't question or hold people accountable. So yeah, I think it's pretty important. But yeah, there's lots of confusion because I think, it is quite a new thing and it's always evolving. And all those headlines and the, Terminator robots, that doesn't really help our case very much. So yeah.
Awesome. So just sort of carrying on from that then. So it strikes me that some of the work that you do, and you've just alluded to it there, could act as a really powerful mechanism for overcoming some of those perceptual barriers, particularly within, I suspect, large organizations where fear of change is almost always the greatest barrier to any transformational project. So I just wonder, would you be able to give some examples of the kinds of AI machine learning activities that you deliver, that you engage in with people, and the way that they can bring to life those otherwise abstract and mysterious concepts?
Yeah, sure. So, and as I said, over the last 3 years, I've been working in the world of AI and creativity. That's my sort of sector, as it were. I mean, AI is being used for so many things in so many different sectors, but I'm really particularly interested in the way that it can be used to augment human creativity and how we can use it as, new jump off points or starting points for our own creative thinking. So that's kind of where I sit just before I go into the projects, because some of them might seem a bit bonkers. But yeah, so I suppose just go over just maybe 3 projects that we did at Tiny Giant. So I do my own stuff. I go out and run workshops and the like, but I'm also founded a company called Tiny Giant, and AI and creativity has been a really big part of that business. One of the first projects that we did, which was back in 2018, was to create the world's first AI curator for a science festival. So it was Cheltenham Science Festival in the UK, and they came to us. So every year they have human curators who pull together some content for the festival. And the coordinator of that festival messaged us, or I think it was an email one evening, and just said, I've had this crazy idea and I feel like you guys might be able to help me, but I'd really like to have an AI curator this year. So not, who would sit alongside the human curators for the festival. And this was like a dream project for us. So we were super excited. So one of the things the curators do each year is to come up with talk suggestions for the festival. So we needed to use an AI algorithm to help come up with talk suggestions. So in terms of what we did, we basically got every single talk that had ever been delivered at the Cheltenham Science Festival, so 10 years worth of talks. And myself and my co-founder, we went through every brochure from those 10 years and stripped out all of the talk titles and little sort of detail about the talk. And we used that and we trained a neural network, so a form of machine learning algorithm, on all of those talks. So it was able to generate its own talks. And so a range of talks were generated for the festival, which were very weird and wonderful. And we also had to come up with a kind of look for our algorithm, because obviously a bunch of code doesn't really sit very nicely in the front of a brochure alongside 2 human curators. So we created this kind of modern day version of Ada Lovelace from which she was a kind of cool character. We called her Ada, obviously after Ada Lovelace, but it was AIDA. And so generated lots of talks. So the machine learning algorithm generated talks, and one of those was actually delivered at the Cheltenham Science Festival. It was called Introvert Narwhals, and there was lots of talks generated. I mean, hundreds of talks, and Cheltenham couldn't decide which one to go with, but we put it out on public vote on Twitter, and Introvert Narwhals was chosen. So that was delivered by a natural history presenter at the Cheltenham Science Festival. So it was a talk generated by AI but delivered by a human. And then I sat on a panel at that event as well, and we talked about how AI was being used in creativity, and also and how it was infiltrating into our culture. So that was an interesting topic in terms of bringing that to life, because I think Cheltenham Science Festival wanted AI to become, especially in that year when AI was very much, in everywhere, and anywhere you looked, there's something about the AI somewhere. They wanted to start conversations around AI at the festival. So that was a really nice way of, beginning that conversation. And it had this kind of something you could look at where it felt quite tangible. And we spoke about the process and how it all came to be. And it was just also quite fun. And reached quite a lot of blogs, and it got quite a lot of news attention. We even took Ada onto BBC Radio in the morning show and gave her an AI generated voice so she could answer questions. And it was a great project. So that was our sort of first project in that area. And then alongside that, and 2 other projects I've really loved as part of our businesses, and they're both alcohol related, so I'm not really sure what that says about me. But the first one is AI cocktails, and this was a project that we did for fun, really, just because we were really interested in how AI could support or help someone who is very creative, so how it could work alongside a creative mind. And so we, again, same with the Ada curator, we trained a neural network on hundreds and hundreds of cocktail recipes, so every cocktail recipe we could find. And then the neural network was able to generate new cocktail recipes. And then, they in themselves, they were pretty cool. We were like, wow, these are really like crazy. But rather than just going, yeah, these are cool, we took them to a mixologist and said, can you bring, the ones that you think are really exciting, could you bring some of them to life for us? And, the amazing thing about the human mixologist is he's got an amazing palate. He understands what flavors go together. And so we just chose three different cocktails, which he made up and turned into reality. But one of them, for example, was a sour cherry, champagne and courgette cocktail. And he just made it really amazing, because I guess if you just literally took that as the recipe, you could grate some courgette into a glass or something. It wouldn't taste so good. But, he made it into like a tincture, like a kind of syrup, and mixed it all together and made it really amazing. It was interesting because that was just a fun project to see how it would inspire him to think of new ways of working, or, whether it could take his thinking in new directions. But the cocktails got quite a lot of coverage, interestingly, and people seem to really love them. And we've since, in the last like 2.5 years, served them up at tech events all over the world, and Austria, America, Berlin, just so many places, and obviously in the UK as well. And I think one of the reasons, and you were saying earlier about that sort of bringing it to life a bit, is that it does bring it to life, because AI is something that's not very tangible, and to actually hold a cocktail that machine learning has been a part of, that the creation of that cocktail that you're holding and drinking, it's a great conversation starter. And with some of the events we've done, we've also done an accompanying video where we take people through the process, and some of the events have had that video playing at the bar, so people can very quickly see how the cocktail's been created. And it's just nice to hold them. They're fun, they're colourful, and they're often a little bit weird and wonderful. But so that's been really good. And we did a similar thing with the gin as well. We created the world's first AI gin, same kind of process, worked with a little distillery in Bristol, and they brought it to life, this first AI gin. We also used AI to name it as well, so we trained again a neural network on hundreds of gin names, and we also put some beer names in there. And I also threw in some star constellations and some like mythical creatures to give it kind of see what would come out. And again, hundreds of names generated, but they chose one called Monka's Garkle, which is, they said it sounded slightly gin-like, but also slightly offbeat. So AI generated gin went into the world. Monka's Garkle, that's sold out. We did a run of 1,000, sort of limited edition run, and it was very cool and very nice. It actually won some taste awards and all sorts, so we were quite pleased about that. But that's the kind of stuff I do. And then I run creative sessions in businesses and with individuals, mainly using art making as a way forward. So AI is also, machine learning is also brilliant for art making. So you can create some really wonderful pieces and go through the whole sort of process of machine learning, creating a data set to training a neural network and then generating an output, which is often very beautiful and very interesting. And I found this to be a really great vehicle for opening conversations around AI. I did a session a couple of weeks ago at Exeter University, and it was just, the art making was brilliant. There was some great stuff that came out, but actually it was the conversations around it that were really important. And just the questions people asking, things about, will it be like the sci-fi movies that I've seen? Will AI just infiltrate our lives? Do we, how important is it that we understand it, or does it just sort of come into our lives and we just accept it for what it is? Or so many questions. And I think having something tangible, whether it's a cocktail or making some art or drinking gin or whatever it might be, those things are a really great way of making things feel a bit more real and understanding. And I think with art making particularly, because you go through that process, it's a great way of understanding it in a practical way.
Almost like irrespective of what the transformation project is. I mean, I guess it wouldn't even necessarily have to be AI orientated, or obviously it'd be great if it was, but just as a way of breaking the ice, getting people to think a bit creatively, getting people to, I guess, kind of swap that fear in their minds for a bit of excitement and a bit of positivity. Presumably that's such a powerful initial mechanism, is it? And because so many of these projects, they've sort of failed before they've even begun, right? Because they just don't have the buy-in from people at that kind of like emotional level. So presumably this is such a powerful mechanism for just getting that initial process underway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great way to kick off something like some kind of digital transformation project. And if you're using AI, it's absolutely fantastic because it gives people a basic understanding. And like you say, digital transformation projects, it's hard to make those successful if the team aren't on board or if people don't understand, especially at the moment with AI and people being quite afraid of it. If you were a business who wanted to start implementing AI or automation into your business, people need to be on board with that. And if they don't understand, or if they're scared, they kind of, might back off, or they won't go with you on that journey. And obviously it's vital that you have people with you. So things like this do really help. And as I mentioned with the art making particularly, I can go into a business and people can physically go through the machine learning process, as in, we would go out and take some photographs to create a data set. We would then train the neural network. We would then generate some pieces of art. So you go through the process and you understand some of the basics around how AI and machine learning actually work. And then obviously we can have wider conversations, because when you actually go through the process, or you make something with AI or machine learning, and you don't have to be able to code, that's the thing. When I go into businesses, or into universities, or even schools, I use programs or platforms that don't require code, so people can experiment and explore and play. Obviously they need to understand the processes, but you don't have to be able to code or be some kind of amazing developer to do it. You can play and work in this space without having to do that. So when you do that, that's when you start going, okay, so I need this data set, and what does that need to look like? And when I do the training, how is this actually working? And when I've got the output, how do I feel about that? The fact that as a human, I have worked alongside a machine learning algorithm to create that. How does that make me feel as a human? What, is it even art? Does art need to be totally human? Can it be totally art if it's made by a machine? All those things come up, and it's brilliant. So for after those sessions, and they don't need to be that long, it can be anything, just a half day session, people will have a much better understanding, which means then if you start implementing AI, machine learning, people kind of go, okay, I get that, I understand it, and therefore, and I know what it can do, and I know what the potentials are, and I also know what the dangers are. And if, then people are more likely to have less of that fear associated with it, because they understand what they're playing with and what you as a business might be playing with. So it's just much easier to get on board. So yeah, I think it's I've not really necessarily thought about it from a digital transformation point of view, but it works absolutely perfectly.
Yeah. And presumably one of the things it does in that context is demonstrate the value of human input as well. As you say, it's a collaborative thing, and it could absolutely be done entirely by the machine, but presumably you can see a contrast between that and when it's more collaborative between the human and the machine. And that must be quite an important part of the conversation, an important thing for people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing with AI is, we're not at the point of AI like in the movies, that's ultimately anything AI now is machine learning, and someone a human has to be involved in it to start it, as in you need a data set, or you need humans to label the whatever you need to label. It's no AI is without a human input at the moment, what's out there at the moment. So ultimately a human is behind it, or a human has decided to create that piece of machine learning, or to create that algorithm. And so we always have to remember that. I think you kind of go, oh, AI is this thing and it exists in its own right, and it's independent, and maybe that will be one day in the future. But right now, we as human beings are making these decisions around AI, and that, that's important to understand. No machine learning algorithm is starting on its own. We are starting it. And then, yes, for sure, it goes off and makes it, once it's been trained, it can then make predictions and go off and do its own thing essentially. But yeah, humans behind all of it. But as you said, what a lot of the projects that I've done that I'm particularly interested in is that sort of working alongside it, because I'm really interested in how, as humans and as with amazing creative minds, what we can do alongside AI, how it can make us think differently, or how it can augment our own creative skills. So I think that's interesting. And it's also interesting because I was thinking about going back to the cocktails. When we first started working with the mixologist, I remember talking to him over the phone and going to see him. And when we got there and I talked him through the recipes, and he was just like, oh, I don't want to do it. I just, AI is going to be loads better than me. It's going to come and take my jobs. I don't want to do it. And it was just like, oh no, but we've agreed to, you're going to do it. Anyway, so we talked quite a lot about it, and it was like these are a starting point for you. That I know they're not necessarily what you've seen before and what the recipes are before, but you have this amazing palette and this real depth of understanding, and we'd really love you to use it as almost like a brainstorming. You've got these new and weird and wonderful things. What can you do with it? And actually, it took him a while, but once he got into it, it's like, actually, I really like this. And interestingly, on his bar, before lockdown this was, but when I went back into his bar, he had this like little storage cabinet of all these like drawers, all these strange things in, because he just started to play with all these new ingredients that he'd never tried before. And also I noticed on his at one point, looking at his cocktail list, there was this like interesting cocktail. I was like, oh, that looks very familiar. He's like, yeah, I use that as a base. So, it's interesting watching the transition between someone being terrified and then once they get involved and realize, actually, as a human, I still have a big part to play. As a creative mind, I can do something different here. That I think that's really interesting. I'm working with a potter at the moment as well, so a ceramicist, and we've pulled together a data set together. So all these beautiful vessels that we found and that we've been really inspiring, and we've trained a neural network on all of those, and it's now generated a whole series of like really cool, interesting designs. And she's as a human creative, she's now picking some of those designs and saying, okay, I really like this kind of rip effect here, and I really like the texture, and I think I can make that if I do this, this, and this. And so she's going to then make a vessel using the AI generated output as a form of inspiration, which I just think is so exciting. So yeah, I love the idea of us working together, and I think going forward that will become a much bigger thing in terms of the business side of things as well. That we will use AI to do some of the either inspiring stuff like I've just spoken about, but also some of the more base work that we might not necessarily really love doing at the moment. So if AI can help us to do that, it will give us more time to do more sort of strategic thinking and more interesting stuff. So yeah, I think that would be a big thing going forward.
Are you aware of many large companies using the kind of activities that you're using? And I'm no expert in digital transformation, but I've been around a reasonable amount of it. And it seems to me that there's basically two obstacles invariably. One is a lack of data, and the other is humans, basically just like not understanding it, too much fear, too much not sort of having that kind of initial buy-in and then sort of working against it. And it just strikes me that you kind of have almost maybe not a complete solution, but a partial solution to the second one of those. And there are so many of these projects taking place, every day around the world. But without that human buy-in and as you say, that sort of the kind of inspiration and creativity you're able to inject through these activities, I just think that could be so powerful. So from your experience, are you aware of other companies doing this?
Not that I've come across. I mean, sure, AI is being used in a lot of businesses in a lot of ways. And I know in things like in newspapers and publishing, people are starting to use AI to do some of the base work there. There are, in terms of marketing, there's big AI copywriting tools. There's companies called Phrasey and Passado, which I don't know if you've heard of them, but I guess they don't necessarily work alongside you, but they can create things like subject lines and SMS notifications and basic web copy and things like that. So I guess some of those, they can do some of the groundwork and then leave you to do some of the more interesting stuff. As a copywriter for 18 years, writing subject lines wasn't always always the nicest job to be doing. So if an AI could come and help me to do that, or to do that on my behalf, then that would be great. So I think there's obviously IBM Watson. There's lots of tools. GPT-3 is by OpenAI is a huge text generation tool, which I think is starting to be used to underpin a lot of things like video gaming and all sorts of things. So I think there are those big platforms. I don't know how many businesses are tapping into them from a creative point of view. But yeah, that idea of working alongside, I think, is becoming a bit more commonplace. But in terms of the creativity, I don't really know. I'd love to, if there's anyone out there that is, I'd love to talk to them, because I do sometimes think it would be really nice to work with other people who are working in a similar space, just so we could chat and bounce off each other and see how people are using it creatively. But it still feels like it's a bit of a new thing, really, the creative side. I mean, AI and art making is still quite new in itself. So then, working with creative minds is probably, even newer. But yeah.
No, I think it's so interesting. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's no shortage of kind of functional applications out there, but
Yeah, exactly.
but certainly from a creative perspective, and I think that in a sense almost needs to come first, because I think without the creative, the human element, people are never really going to buy into it or never really understand the fundamentals or the implications. And yeah, it just strikes me as such a fascinating area. Just moving on to a slightly different topic then. Over the last few years, there's been a huge emphasis on really nailing the customer journey. I just wonder if you've encountered any kind of creative ways that the kind of tech that you're using could be leveraged to enhance the customer experience or kind of, sort of elevate brands in other ways. Because obviously we've focused on, in a sense, the sort of internal implications so far in the conversation from a sort of employee perspective. I'm assuming that a lot of this stuff potentially could be used more sort of outwardly for the brands as well.
Because I come from a marketing background, so before setting up Tiny Giant 3 years ago, I worked as a copywriter and creative head, and managed creative teams in advertising and marketing. So for 18 years. So although I don't necessarily work in the AI and marketing space, that feels slightly different from where I sit. I'm still obviously interested in what's going on in that world. So yeah, I mean, AI machine learning is being used a lot, I think, or starting to be used in the world of marketing. I think one of the most commonplace areas is being used, and everyone will know this, but in terms of Spotify, Netflix, and Amazon, those kind of product recommendations that we see, that's all machine learning. So when it's always amazing, isn't it, when you go onto Amazon, they recommend a book, and you're like, oh, actually, that does sound really good. It's so clever. And in terms of customer experience, that's amazing that when you use Spotify, you finish playing the song, and it plays another one that you also like. So those kind of things are very commonplace in our life but we might not necessarily go like, oh, that's AI, or that's machine learning. It's just so normal now to us. But yeah, there's apart from those big tech giants, there's also publishers and content creators are starting to use that similar kind of technology so that they can serve up articles that they know their customers or readers are going to like, or even personalized content blocks, things like that. So it's starting to be used in that way, which is which will be interesting to see how that works. Things like customer segmentation, it works very well there. Traditionally in terms of segmentation, we tend to group things as humans into large, relatively generic groups of around age, or whether you bought before, or where you're based, that kind of thing. Obviously with machine learning, it's a whole different ball game. It's really, you can very quickly analyze data, create much more targeted segments, and you can then also even go further than that by automatically adjusting campaigns to be more personalized for each segment. And obviously the thing with machine learning is that it can detect an unlimited number and size of segments. So it can find patterns that maybe we wouldn't even think about, or we wouldn't even spot. So things like that is, I think, in terms of segmentation, it would be really interesting to see again how that's working. And I'm sure lots of companies are already using that or starting to use that. Also sentiment analysis, AI and sentiment analysis, and I know IBM Watson does that as well. And I think you can get almost a very small element of that for free if you're interested in looking at sentiment analysis. But companies are starting to use that within their marketing and advertising. So I know this was probably last year, but I remember Dunkin' Donuts used a Google AI tool to analyze a YouTube video they were creating. So they were launching a new product, and they wanted to make sure that it had a really positive sentiment. They wanted to be the most positive thing they'd ever done. And so they used this Google AI tool, and they were able to establish a sentiment score for that video they were just about to launch. And then they were able to look at every single video they'd ever done and work out the sentiment scores of those. And then they were then pretty sure then actually this one we're going to launch is the most positive that we've ever done. And what's really interesting about that is apparently, according to the news around that, is that piece of information was reached within 28 minutes. So I think, and that that's the thing, that it's the speed of this, the machine learning, the speed of the insights, the speed of the ability to segment all those things. What would have taken us so long, we'd have to have watched every video individually and go, oh, how do we feel after watching this? But actually to be able to do in 28 minutes to go, yeah, I've got a sentiment score for all of my videos, and I know this one's super positive, so let's launch that one. And it obviously went out and did really, really well. And I've also mentioned the copywriting tools as well, like Phrasey and Passado, which are out there already working in the world of marketing. And then in terms of creative uses, and I think a lot of the things that I've just talked about are very much quite practical things. They're more about efficiency and effectiveness. There's a couple of creative uses. So Lexus did, and again, this was probably a while ago. So I think this was probably 2018 as well. Lexus did an ad which was the first AI written TV ad. And I'm not sure if you remember that, but they used AI to generate a script for their latest TV ad, and they also use sentiment analysis in that too. So they used as a data set hundreds and hundreds of Cannes Lion award-winning scripts. So it was already being based on something that they knew were very good scripts already. They used sentiment analysis to see which parts of those scripts resonated most with the audience, and then they created this AI generated script. But as going back to the human side of things, it wasn't just like, oh, let's just take this script. It was like, let's give it to Kevin MacDonald, who's like an award-winning film director, and he can then take this script and turn it into this ad. And I'd love to have seen that process of how much that film director added to that process. But yeah, so it launched. I have to say, it's probably not the best ad I've ever seen, but I really admired their innovative approach and saying, okay, what can this do and what's possible. And it's cool. It got a lot of column space for them, as you can imagine, as a brand. So there's also that side of things as well. Talking back to our AI gin, we work with a very small gin distillery in Bristol, and that when the gin launched, I think it hit something like 5 continents within the first 2 days. I don't know. It literally went everywhere. And this tiny little gin distillery in Bristol just had coverage in all these huge publications. So there was a point. I'm not sure if you get that so much now. When we were doing these creative projects, there was a lot of if you did something with AI that was a bit interesting and different, you'd get a lot of column space. You'd definitely get noticed. People would talk about you. And I guess I feel like now the new thing is the whole NFT world. If you say NFT now, everyone, I don't know, it fills so many column spaces. But, there's that PR side of thing as well. There was also a really nice campaign that was done by a charity called Malaria No More. It's worth looking it up. It's really good. It's got David Beckham in it, and he, using a range of machine learning tools, they enabled him to speak multiple languages. So he delivered this kind of talk at a kitchen table and just very, very seamlessly moved between so many different languages. And it was all about malaria and combating malaria. So it's quite an important message to deliver. But I know that video and the wider campaign reached something like 1.6 billion people worldwide. So sometimes I suppose using machine learning in a creative way definitely gets you noticed. And that video got shared a lot. But also, I suppose, because you could seamlessly translate, and what happened using the technology, David Beckham's mouth moved. It was kind of using that deepfake technology, which is called first order motion, because deepfake's always associated with really negative things. But so he delivered it, and it looked really amazing. But obviously, because he could speak in multiple languages, he was able to resonate with more people. So, and it would just be great to see more people getting involved and doing interesting things. And I suppose it was the same with the ADA, that our AI curator for the Cheltenham Science Festival. Actually that got a lot of column space as well, and it was just interesting. And we starting her off, actually, that initially just the curator was just to generate a range of talk suggestions for the festival back in 2019. But then during COVID, that festival went online, and then she became the face of the online festival. And we're now taking her further and developing her into a sort of virtual character. So she's now like a 3D character, almost like a 3D influencer, virtual influencer. So she can be a representative for women in science, or for science in general, across for younger people and activists and all sorts. So she's doing a lot more. So sometimes what starts as a very small creative project can also go much further. And the coordinator at the Cheltenham Science Festival, Marika, she's really into constantly evolving and developing and using technology as it evolves. So that's been a really nice project. Yeah, I mean, there's so much you can do.
That's awesome. Are there any, from I guess more of a kind of B2B, I just wonder, are there any kind of creative sort of applications of AI and machine learning from a user experience perspective that you're sort of particularly aware of?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the close would be, in terms of project I've worked on, the ADA one we've just been talking about, because now ADA is a representative for science. So we're working with other businesses. Yeah, I still think it's very early days, really. And I suppose, the big advertisers and B2C are going to be the ones that adopt it initially. But yeah, not that I know of, but I'm sure there are. They're just not sitting necessarily in my space right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's so interesting. And often a conversation I have with people about this stuff, it always strikes me that a common theme in all those conversations is people will say, it's still kind of very early on. We're still, we're not quite at that point. A lot of these, certainly in the B2B world, a lot of things that we refer to as things like machine learning very often are actually fairly rudimentary forms of robotics and technology that may have existed for quite a long time, but they may have been kind of rebundled, repackaged, and sort of resold to the market with a slightly different value proposition. But this conversation has given me a sense that maybe we're not as far away as sometimes I think we are from maybe reaching that inflection point where, all industries look at this stuff as actually just kind of a fundamental part of their toolkit.
Yeah, I feel like that. I think that will become the case. And, even in the last 3 years, I've noticed that machine learning tools have become much more democratized and accessible. You don't, I think, even 3 years ago, we were working very closely with developers to help us to bring anything to life. And actually now I can, and I am learning to code, but I'm not a developer by any means, but it's accessible for me. I can go in and I can make art with machine learning, or I can use a notebook on Google Colab that's been shared on GitHub, and I can make something with that. And things like I was saying about Phrasee and Passado, the copywriting tools, and things like copy.ai, they are things you can use as a business or even as an individual and go and explore it. And I think as that happens, I think as more people start making tools which are accessible to the non-coders or to smaller businesses, because I think massive, huge corporates can start using these things a lot sooner than small businesses. But the copy.ai, for example, if you want to help with your copywriting, a small business could use that, and it's totally accessible. And that's just one tiny example in a very small niche area. And that, I think that will happen a lot more, that people will be able to harness machine learning and AI for themselves, even as a small business, and start using it to save themselves time and effort, or even to stimulate new creative thoughts or ideas to help them to innovate and create new products and things like that. So yeah, I do think it is, like you say, it is still very early days, but even in the 3 years I've been working here, there's been such a huge development in that time. And I can imagine that in the next three, there'll be even more, and actually people will just be using it, and it'll be probably be quite normal, that it'll just be kind of like, oh yeah, we do that, and it's machine learning or it's AI, underpins that piece of technology, and that's the way it works. But yeah, it's interesting to see, because it's just changing all the time.
That's awesome. I mean, even just this conversation has triggered a whole bunch of kind of thoughts and ideas in my mind. So I can only imagine what one of those cocktail making AI classes must be like. No, awesome stuff. Well, look, thank you so much for your time, Kerry. Really, really enjoyed it. I've been really looking forward to this one. So thanks ever so much for sharing all of your experiences and ideas.
Pleasure. It's lovely. Thank you so much for having me.